As the plane soared through the clouds, the tension was unbearable. Claire, a middle-aged white woman, stood over Marcus, her voice dripping with disdain. "You people think you can just do whatever you want," she sneered, loud enough for everyone on the plane to hear. Passengers turned to stare as her rant escalated, accusing Marcus of stealing her seat and demanding he move. Her words were cruel, filled with venom, and Marcus sat silently, his jaw clenched, trying to keep his cool. The flight attendants rushed over, but before anyone could intervene, Claire crossed the line. She pulled Marcus's bag from the overhead bin and dumped its contents into the aisle, mocking him in front of everyone. "Maybe if you were more like us, you'd know how to act," she spat. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, a calm voice broke through the chaos. "Ma'am, I think you should sit down," said the pilot, who had emerged from the cockpit. All eyes turned to Marcus as the pilot continued. "Mr. Johnson is not only a passenger on this flight, he's the owner of the airline." Claire froze, her face draining of color as the realization hit her. But what will Marcus do now? Will he let this insult slide, or show everyone who he really is? Stay tuned to find out, because what you think is going to happen next isn't even close to the shocking truth. Now, let's go back to how this all started. The moment the passengers settled into their seats, the airplane buzzed with excitement. It was a long flight, and most people were ready to kick back and relax. Everyone except for one woman, Mrs. Claire Thompson. Her perfectly curled blonde hair and expensive designer purse screamed wealth, and her attitude backed it up. As Claire sat down in first class, she glanced to her left and froze. Sitting next to her was a tall black man, dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans. She scrunched her nose in disgust, as if the very sight of him had ruined her day. "What is he doing here?" Claire muttered under her breath, but loud enough for the man to hear. His eyes met hers, calm and patient, as if this wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him. Claire's attitude got worse. She waved her hand to get the attention of a flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and demanding. "I need to change my seat. I'm not comfortable sitting here." The flight attendant, a polite young woman, looked confused. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but first class is fully booked. Is something wrong with your seat?" Claire huffed, crossing her arms. "Yes, something is wrong. I don't feel safe sitting next to this man." She pointed at him as if he were some kind of danger. The black man sat quietly, watching the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. Other passengers began to notice the commotion, and whispers filled the air. The flight attendant, now clearly uncomfortable, glanced between Claire and the man, unsure of what to do. "I assure you, ma'am," the attendant said nervously, "there's no need to be concerned. This passenger has every right to be here." "That's not the point," Claire snapped, her voice rising. "I don't want to sit next to someone like him. I paid good money for this seat, and I demand to be moved." By now, several people were watching, and the tension in the air was thick. The black man could have said something. He could have spoken up, defended himself, maybe even demanded an apology. But instead, he stayed silent. His calmness only seemed to make Claire angrier. "Are you just going to sit there and say nothing?" Claire spat, glaring at him. "What, you don't have anything to say for yourself?" Typical. The man looked at her, his face calm but his eyes deep with something unspoken. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but before he could, the flight attendant stepped in. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to please lower your voice and remain seated," the attendant said firmly. "Everyone on this plane is here to travel peacefully, and we won't tolerate any disruptive behavior." Claire's face turned red with frustration. Disruptive behavior. I'm the one being disrespected here. Suddenly, a deep voice interrupted, cutting through the noise like a knife. "That's enough," said the man sitting next to Claire. His voice was calm, but there was an authority in it that made everyone stop and listen. He wasn't loud, but the way he spoke made it clear he was someone used to being in control. For the first time, Claire seemed taken aback. She hadn't expected him to speak up like that. And for a moment, she looked unsure. But then she doubled down. "Who do you think you are, talking to me like that?" she hissed. The man leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving hers. "Who am I?" he repeated, a hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "You'll find out soon enough." And just like that, the plane hit a patch of turbulence. The sudden jolt shook everyone in their seats, and Claire gasped, grabbing onto her armrests. The lights flickered for a brief moment, and the plane steadied again, but the tension inside the cabin didn't ease. The other passengers were still watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Claire, shaken but not willing to back down, shot another glare at the man. "I don't care who you think you are," she muttered. "You don't belong here." The man stayed silent, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes now, something that made the other passengers wonder, who was this man? Suddenly, the captain's voice crackled over the speaker, announcing that they would soon be preparing for takeoff. The flight attendants hurried to finish their checks, and Claire, though still fuming, stayed in her seat. But as the plane began to taxi down the runway, the whispers among the passengers grew louder. Some had their phones out, discreetly recording the interaction. Claire had made a scene, but she had no idea that this moment would come back to haunt her. Everyone was wondering, what would happen next? Who was the man she had insulted so cruelly? As the plane took off into the sky, the answer to that question remained hanging in the air, just like the tension between Claire and the man beside her. Claire leaned back in her seat, trying to act as if nothing had happened, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in her chest. She glanced over at the man once more, but he was looking out the window, completely unbothered. It was as if he knew something she didn't. And then, just when Claire thought the worst of the situation was behind her, the pilot's voice came over the intercom again, announcing that there would be a special guest addressing the passengers soon. The words sent a ripple of curiosity through the cabin. Claire frowned, not paying much attention at first, until she noticed the black man beside her straightening in his seat. Without warning, he stood up, smoothing out his clothes. He turned toward the aisle, walking calmly toward the front of the plane. Claire's jaw dropped as she watched him. What was he doing? Was he the special guest? Her heart raced as she tried to piece together what was happening. But before she could make sense of it all, the man's voice echoed through the cabin, and his true identity began to unfold. As the black man walked toward the front of the plane, the whispers grew louder. Passengers craned their necks, trying to see what was going on. Claire's face twisted with confusion and a hint of panic. She had been so sure of herself just moments ago, but now, something felt wrong. Very wrong. The man approached one of the flight attendants, who gave him a respectful nod and handed him a microphone. Claire's eyes widened in disbelief. What was happening? The man's calm, deep voice echoed through the cabin as he spoke into the microphone, his words clear and steady. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Marcus Harris, and I'm honored to be flying with you today." A wave of gasps and murmurs swept through the passengers. Dr. Marcus Harris. Claire's mind raced. That name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it right away. She shot a confused glance at the passengers around her, many of whom were now whispering excitedly, their eyes glued to Marcus. "I'm a professor of aerospace engineering," Dr. Harris continued, "and a guest speaker for this flight, as we'll be discussing some of the latest advancements in aviation technology later on during our journey." Now the pieces began to fall into place. Dr. Marcus Harris wasn't just any passenger. He was someone important. Very important. Claire's face turned pale as she stared at him, her mouth slightly open. This was the man she had humiliated. The same man she had demanded be moved away from her because she didn't feel safe sitting next to him. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers shifting toward her now, their gazes filled with judgment and disbelief. But Marcus didn't stop there. With grace and humility, He continued addressing the passengers as if nothing had happened, as if Claire hadn't just tried to shame him in front of the entire plane. I'm here today to share some of my work with you all, as part of a special event organized by the airline. I spent years researching and developing new ways to make air travel safer, more efficient, and more environmentally friendly. He smiled, and his warmth spread through the cabin. But more than that, I'm just like anyone else here. I'm a traveler, a father, a husband, and above all, someone who believes in treating people with kindness and respect. Claire's heart sank deeper with every word he spoke. She had treated him like he was less than her, like he didn't belong. But here he was, standing in front of everyone, not only a respected professional, but also someone with far more dignity and kindness than she had shown him. And while I'm excited to share my work with you later, Marcus said, glancing briefly at Claire before turning his gaze to the rest of the passengers, I want to remind everyone that how we treat each other is just as important as anything else. After all, we're all flying together, sharing this experience. The weight of his words hit Claire like a punch to the gut. She sank lower in her seat, wishing she could disappear. Her cheeks burned with shame, and she avoided making eye contact with anyone, especially Marcus. He hadn't once directly called her out or mentioned what she had done, but his message was clear to everyone listening. The flight attendants, who had witnessed the whole exchange earlier, looked at each other, some with smiles of approval, others with knowing glances at Claire. She could feel their judgment now. They had tried to defuse the situation, but Claire had made it worse with her arrogance. And now, everyone knew just how wrong she had been. Dr. Marcus Harris finished his short speech, and the passengers broke into applause. Some even stood up to cheer for him. Claire sat frozen in her seat, the clapping around her feeling like 1,000 tiny daggers. Thank you, Marcus said humbly, handing the microphone back to the flight attendant. He turned and walked back down the aisle, heading straight for his seat next to Claire. Claire felt her heart pounding as Marcus returned to his seat. She didn't know what to do, what to say. Should she apologize? Would he accept it? Her mind was spinning, but she knew she couldn't just sit there and say nothing. Marcus sat down, settling into his seat with the same calm composure he had shown all along. He didn't look at her, didn't say a word. It was as if the whole thing had never happened. But for Claire, the weight of her actions was unbearable. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. I didn't know, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know who you were. Marcus turned his head slowly, meeting her eyes for the first time since he had spoken to the passengers. His expression was calm, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. And if I wasn't Dr. Marcus Harris, he said softly, would it have made a difference? Claire felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. The question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. She had treated him terribly, not because of who he was, but because of what he looked like. And now, faced with the truth, she had no answer. I'm sorry, Claire whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. She had never felt so small, so ashamed of herself. Marcus nodded slightly, but he didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The lesson was clear. For the rest of the flight, Claire sat in silence, her thoughts swirling. She replayed the entire encounter in her mind over and over, wishing she could take back every cruel word she had said. But the damage was done. Hours passed, and as the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they would soon be landing. The tension in the cabin had eased, but for Claire, the guilt weighed heavier than ever. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied toward the gate, passengers began to gather their belongings, preparing to disembark. Claire hesitated, unsure of what to do. She didn't want to leave without saying something more to Marcus, but she also didn't know if he would even want to hear it. Just as she was about to stand up, Marcus looked at her, his expression gentle but firm. People make mistakes, he said quietly, but it's how we learn from them that matters. Claire's eyes filled with tears again, and she nodded, unable to find the words. She knew he was right. She had made a terrible mistake, but she also knew she had to do better moving forward. As Marcus stood up to leave, several passengers approached him, shaking his hand and thanking him for his work. Claire watched from her seat, her heart heavy, but also filled with a new sense of understanding. She had learned a hard lesson that day, one she would never forget. But as the crowd around Marcus grew, something unexpected happened. A man wearing a suit stepped forward, his expression stern as he whispered something into Marcus's ear. Marcus's face darkened, and without warning, the man gestured toward the cockpit. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted once again. Something else was happening, something no one had expected. The air in the plane grew tense once more as the suited man whispered urgently into Marcus's ear. Claire, still seated and trying to collect herself after the earlier humiliation, noticed the sudden shift. She wasn't the only one. Many passengers, who had just been congratulating Marcus, were now exchanging worried glances. What now? Claire thought, her heart racing. Hadn't there been enough drama for one flight? Marcus's face had changed. The warm, calm expression he wore while addressing the passengers was gone, replaced by something far more serious. He nodded at the man in the suit and then turned to follow him toward the cockpit. Claire couldn't stop watching. She had no idea what was going on, but a sense of dread crept into her chest. The man in the suit was clearly important, maybe an air marshal or someone in charge. And the way he had approached Marcus, it wasn't casual. It felt like something serious was happening. Passengers began murmuring, trying to figure out what was going on. Some craned their necks to see if they could catch a glimpse of what was happening at the front of the plane. Others grabbed their phones, checking for updates, even though there hadn't been any announcement from the crew. Just as the whispers reached a peak, the cockpit door swung open. The captain stepped out, his face tight with concern. Behind him was Marcus, his expression unreadable. The suited man stayed close to him, whispering occasionally, as if giving instructions. The captain cleared his throat, raising a hand to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but strained, "we have a situation." The murmurs stopped. Silence blanketed the cabin. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, we've been informed that there's a potential security threat on board." Gasps erupted. Claire's stomach dropped. A security threat. The captain continued, trying to calm the passengers. "I want to assure you that we have the situation under control, and we are taking every precaution to ensure your safety." Before anyone could react, Marcus stepped forward. His calm demeanor returned, but there was a sharp edge to his voice now. "Please, everyone, remain calm," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "This is a delicate situation, and we need everyone to cooperate. We are going to be moving a few passengers as part of the security protocol." Now the plane was filled with a low hum of anxious voices. People were on edge, wondering what the threat could be. Was there someone dangerous on board? Was this about terrorism? The fears spread quickly, and Claire felt it too, her heart racing faster than before. Marcus didn't flinch. He remained the picture of calm authority, even as the passengers looked to him for answers. "No one is in immediate danger," he assured them, "but we need to take certain measures." At that moment, several uniformed officers entered the plane, moving with purpose down the aisle. The passengers sat up straighter, their fear mounting as the officers began scanning the faces of those seated in first class. Claire's pulse quickened. She watched as the officers moved closer to her section. Were they going to arrest someone? Was the threat real, or was this all just a false alarm? Then, to her horror, one of the officers stopped right in front of her. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice firm, "we're going to need you to come with us." Claire froze, her eyes wide with shock. "Me," she stammered. But why? I haven't done anything." The officer didn't waver. "Please, Mom, this is for your safety." Claire's heart was pounding so hard she could barely think. She looked around, hoping someone would speak up for her, but the other passengers were silent, watching in disbelief. Even Marcus, who had been so calm and composed earlier, was now standing just a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "I didn't do anything," Claire whispered again, panic rising in her throat. She clutched her purse tightly, feeling as if the walls were closing in on her. The officer reached down, gently but firmly guiding her to stand. "We need you to cooperate, ma'am. It's important." Claire stumbled to her feet, her legs shaky and weak. She had no idea what was happening. Why were they singling her out? What had she done? Fear gripped her like a vice, and for a moment she thought she might faint. As she was led toward the front of the plane, all eyes followed her. She could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment in their eyes. First, she had humiliated herself by insulting Marcus. Now it seemed she was being treated as a potential threat. What is going on? Claire's mind raced. Why are they taking me away? She glanced back at Marcus, who was still standing near his seat, watching her with a strange intensity. For a moment, she wondered if this was some kind of payback for the way she had treated him. Had Marcus used his influence to set this up? But no, that didn't seem right. He hadn't shown any signs of anger or revenge earlier. He had been calm, almost too calm. As the officers guided her toward the exit, Claire's panic reached its peak. Her breathing became shallow, her heart thudding in her chest like a drum. She didn't know where they were taking her, but she was terrified of what would happen next. Just as they reached the door, something even more shocking occurred. The suited man, who had been standing silently near the cockpit, suddenly stepped forward, blocking their path. "Wait," he said, his voice authoritative. The officers paused, looking at him in confusion. "There's been a mistake," the suited man continued, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at Claire. "She's not the one we're looking for." Claire felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly followed by a new wave of confusion. If she wasn't the one they were looking for, then who was? The suited man leaned in, speaking quietly to the officers. Claire couldn't make out the words, but she saw their expressions change. They looked tense, as if something far more serious was going on than they had initially realized. Then, without another word, the officers released her. Claire stumbled back, her mind reeling. She had been so close to being taken away. And now, just like that, she was free. But why? What had changed? As she stood there, trying to catch her breath, the suited man turned and made his way back to the cockpit, followed by Marcus. The plane was now filled with nervous energy, as passengers whispered and speculated about what was going on. But before Claire could gather her thoughts, the captain's voice came over the intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice tight with tension, "we will be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport. I repeat, we are making an emergency landing." The cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers were shouting, asking questions, demanding to know what was happening. Claire's heart sank as she realized that whatever was going on, it wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. As the plane began to descend, the suited man reappeared, moving swiftly toward the back of the plane with the officers at his side. They were looking for someone dangerous. But who? Suddenly, a scream pierced the air. Claire turned just in time to see one of the passengers stand up, his face twisted in rage. He reached into his jacket, pulling out something that made everyone around him freeze in terror. A gun. The sight of the gun sent a ripple of panic through the cabin. Passengers gasped. Some ducked down in their seats, while others froze in sheer terror. The man holding the gun, a tall figure with wild eyes and trembling hands, stood in the aisle, pointing the weapon at the suited officer who had been scanning the plane just moments earlier. "Everybody stay down," the man shouted, his voice shaky but loud. "Nobody move, or I'll—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the threat was clear. The plane, which had been a hive of anxious whispers just seconds ago, fell into an eerie, tense silence. Everyone was too afraid to breathe too loudly, let alone move. Claire felt her heart pounding in her throat, her whole body frozen in fear. She had never been this close to danger before. Just a few feet away, the man stood with his finger on the trigger, and it felt like time had stopped. The officers who had been moving through the aisle earlier now stood still, their eyes locked on the man with the gun. The suited man, who had been so composed and in control, now raised his hands slowly, trying to stay calm. "Listen," the suited man said carefully, his voice steady despite the tension. "We don't want anyone to get hurt. Just put the gun down, and we can talk." The man shook his head violently, waving the gun in the air. "No, no more talking. I've had enough of this." His eyes darted around the cabin, wild with fear and desperation. It was clear that he was spiraling, and no one knew what he would do next. Marcus, who had been standing near the front of the plane, slowly took a step forward. His calmness seemed to radiate through the tension, and despite the chaos, he looked as composed as ever. Claire's eyes darted to him. What was he doing? Why was he stepping forward when the situation was so dangerous? Marcus raised his hand slightly, showing he wasn't a threat. "I know you're scared," he said gently, his voice steady and warm. "But you don't have to do this. Let's figure this out together, okay?" The man's gaze snapped toward Marcus, and for a moment, Claire thought he might pull the trigger. But instead, the man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as if trying to size Marcus up. "Stay back," he yelled, though there was a tremor in his voice. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I will if I have to." Marcus didn't back away. He remained calm, his hand still raised. "I believe you," he said softly. "But whatever you're feeling right now, there's a better way to handle this. We can help you." The man looked conflicted. His grip on the gun tightened, but his eyes flickered with uncertainty. It was clear that Marcus was getting through to him, if only just a little. The rest of the passengers remained frozen, watching the scene unfold in silence, too scared to move or speak. The suited man, still with his hands raised, took a cautious step forward, but the gunman's eyes snapped back to him. "I said stay back," the man shouted, waving the gun in warning. The suited man froze. The air in the cabin was thick with fear. Claire felt sweat trickle down her neck as her mind raced. She had never felt so helpless. Just hours ago, her biggest problem had been her embarrassing outburst toward Marcus. Now she was facing something far more terrifying. She could barely think straight, her thoughts swirling with fear of what could happen next. Suddenly, the plane jolted as it began its descent. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time more urgent. "We are making an emergency landing. I repeat, we will be landing shortly. Everyone, please remain in your seats." The gunman's face twisted with panic as the plane tilted slightly. He stumbled, momentarily off balance, and his finger twitched dangerously on the trigger. Gasps rippled through the cabin as passengers clutched their armrests, fearing the worst. But before anyone could react, Marcus moved. With the speed and precision of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, he lunged forward, grabbing the gunman's wrist and twisting it away from the trigger. The gun went off, but the shot fired into the ceiling, missing everyone. Chaos erupted as passengers screamed, ducking down in their seats. The gunman struggled wildly, trying to wrestle free from Marcus's grip, but Marcus held him firmly. With a swift, practiced movement, he disarmed the man, tossing the gun down the aisle where one of the officers quickly grabbed it. The gunman, now defenseless, fought desperately to break free, but Marcus was too strong. The officers rushed in, pinning the man to the ground and securing him with handcuffs as he screamed in frustration. The entire cabin was in shock. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the labored breathing of the passengers, who had just narrowly escaped a nightmare. Claire, still clutching her seat, stared at Marcus in awe. He had just saved everyone, with a calmness and precision that left her speechless. As the officers dragged the gunman away, the tension in the cabin began to ease. Passengers slowly sat up, glancing around at one another in disbelief. They had been so close to tragedy, Yet somehow, they were safe. Marcus stood there for a moment, catching his breath as the adrenaline slowly faded. He turned and walked back toward his seat, the same calm expression on his face, as if nothing had happened. The passengers watched him with wide eyes, some whispering to one another, others simply staring. Claire couldn't take her eyes off him. This man, the one she had treated so terribly just hours ago, had just saved their lives. And he had done it without hesitation, without anger or resentment. He had acted with bravery and grace, the kind of person she could only hope to be. The plane touched down moments later, the wheels screeching against the tarmac. The emergency landing had been successful, and as soon as the plane came to a stop, paramedics and security teams rushed aboard. They escorted the gunman off the plane and began checking on the passengers, ensuring everyone was safe. Claire sat in stunned silence, still processing everything that had happened. She glanced at Marcus, who was sitting quietly in his seat, seemingly unfazed by the chaos he had just endured. She knew she had to say something to him, not just for the way she had treated him earlier, but for what he had done. He had risked his life to protect everyone. As the plane door opened and passengers began to file out, the suited man gave Marcus one last instruction, and Marcus's face changed. His calm demeanor shifted slightly, and for the first time, Claire saw something else in his eyes. Worry. Before she could ask what was going on, Marcus stood up and followed the suited man off the plane, disappearing into the crowd. Claire stood frozen in place, wondering what on earth could possibly happen next. The passengers slowly disembarked, still dazed from the chaos of the flight. Emergency crews guided everyone toward the terminal, offering blankets and water, but the shock lingered in the air. People whispered to one another, still processing what had just happened. Claire, still standing near the exit, watched Marcus disappear into the crowd with the suited man. She couldn't shake the image of his face just before he left, calm, yet clouded with worry. Something was wrong, but what? Hadn't the threat been neutralized? The gunman was arrested, and they had landed safely. Yet Marcus was being whisked away, and it didn't feel like it was over. She made her way into the terminal, where a group of passengers gathered, waiting for instructions. Some sat quietly, staring off into space. Others were frantically calling family members, explaining the terrifying ordeal they had just survived. Claire, still feeling numb, found an empty chair and sat down, trying to process everything. Her mind replayed the events, the humiliating argument with Marcus, the gunman's attack, and Marcus's heroism. How had everything escalated so quickly? And why had Marcus been taken away so suddenly? She couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play, something no one else was aware of. As Claire sat there, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, seeing dozens of missed calls and messages from her family and friends. News of the emergency landing must have already hit the media. She quickly sent a message letting everyone know she was safe, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Marcus. After everything, she realized she barely knew anything about him. Who was this man who had so calmly disarmed a gunman and then been taken away by a mysterious suited officer? She wanted to find out, but where would she even begin? Just as Claire was lost in thought, a voice interrupted her. "Excuse me, ma'am." She looked up to see a woman in a flight attendant uniform standing in front of her, a concerned expression on her face. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman continued, "but there's someone asking for you." Claire blinked in surprise. "For me? Who?" The flight attendant glanced over her shoulder, then gestured toward a man standing near the security gate. He was tall, dressed in a sharp black suit, and had the same professional, serious demeanor as the man who had taken Marcus away earlier. "He said it's urgent," the flight attendant said. Claire's heart skipped a beat. Urgent? What could this be about? Her first thought was Marcus. Had something happened to him? Without thinking, she stood up and followed the flight attendant toward the man in the suit, her pulse quickening with each step. When they reached the gate, the suited man turned to her, his face expressionless, but his eyes sharp. "Miss Taylor?" he asked. Claire nodded, feeling a knot form in her stomach. "Yes, that's me. Is everything okay? What's going on?" The man gave her a brief, polite smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I need you to come with me. There's someone who would like to speak with you." Claire's mind raced. Who wanted to speak with her? And why? Is this about the flight? About the gunman? The man didn't answer right away. He simply gestured for her to follow him. And without another word, he turned and began walking toward a secured hallway that led away from the terminal. Despite her hesitation, Claire felt an undeniable urge to follow. She needed answers, and this might be her only chance to find out what was really going on. With a deep breath, she hurried after the man. They walked through a series of security checkpoints, each one more restricted than the last. Claire's nerves were on edge as they passed through doors marked authorized personnel only. What was so important that she had to be brought into such a secure area? Finally, they reached a small private lounge tucked away from the busy terminal. The man opened the door and gestured for her to step inside. Claire hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the best of her. She walked in, and the door closed softly behind her. The room was dimly lit, with a large window that overlooked the runway. A figure stood by the window, silhouetted against the bright sunlight. As Claire stepped further into the room, the figure turned to face her. It was Marcus. But something was different. Gone was the warm, approachable man she had seen on the plane. In his place stood someone far more serious, with a look of quiet authority. He wasn't wearing the simple, casual clothes from the flight anymore. Instead, he was dressed in a tailored suit, similar to the man who had escorted her here. "Marcus." Claire's voice wavered with confusion. "What's going on? Why am I here?" Marcus took a deep breath, his expression softening slightly, but his tone remained serious. "Claire, I'm sorry to bring you into this. I didn't want to involve you, but it's become unavoidable." "Involve me in what?" Claire asked, her heart pounding. "What is all this?" Marcus looked out the window for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was low and steady. What happened on the plane wasn't just a random attack. The man with the gun, he wasn't acting alone. Claire's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Are you saying there's more to this?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Yes, there's a larger operation at play here, and it's far more dangerous than anyone realizes. The man on the plane was part of a group that has been planning something much bigger, something we've been trying to stop for months." "We?" Claire asked, her confusion deepening. "Who's we? What are you talking about?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I'm not just a doctor, Claire. I work for an organization that deals with high-level threats, things the public rarely hears about. We operate under the radar, trying to prevent disasters before they happen." Claire's mind was spinning. This sounded like something out of a spy movie, not real life. "So, you're telling me you're some kind of secret agent?" Marcus gave her a wry smile. "Something like that." Claire stared at him in disbelief. The man she had insulted, argued with, and then watched disarm a gunman was now telling her he was part of a covert organization. It was too much to take in. "But why am I here? What does this have to do with me?" Marcus's expression darkened. "Because you've been seen with me. The people we're dealing with. They don't leave loose ends. I didn't want you to be involved, but now they know who you are." Claire's heart dropped. "What do you mean? Am I in danger?" Marcus met her eyes, his gaze intense. "I'm afraid so." Claire felt her legs go weak. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. Just hours ago, she had been on a simple flight, and now she was being told she was in danger because of some shadowy group targeting a man who wasn't who he appeared to be. "So what happens now?" Claire whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Marcus's face was grim. "Now we protect you, but we have to move fast. There's more at stake here than just the gunman on the plane. Something much bigger is coming, and we don't have much time to stop it. Before Claire could ask any more questions, the door behind her opened again, and the suited man who had brought her here stepped back inside. "It's time," the man said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to move." Marcus nodded, then turned back to Claire. "You're coming with us. We need to keep you safe while we figure out our next move." Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she followed Marcus and the suited man out of the room. She had no idea what she was walking into, but one thing was clear: her life would never be the same again. Claire's world felt like it was spinning as she hurried behind Marcus and the suited man through a series of narrow hallways. The clamor of the airport faded away, replaced by the sterile, quiet hum of fluorescent lights. Her mind was racing, trying to catch up with the impossible reality she had just been thrust into. She glanced at Marcus, his jaw tight with focus as they moved quickly. The man she had scorned on the plane now seemed like a completely different person. He moved with purpose, his calm demeanor from before replaced by the urgency of someone on a mission. "Where are we going?" Claire finally asked, her voice trembling as they made a sharp turn into another corridor. "We're heading to a secure location," Marcus replied, his tone clipped but reassuring. "We need to get you off the grid until we can figure out how to handle this." The suited man ahead of them glanced back briefly, but said nothing, his eyes scanning the hallway, as if checking for threats. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. What had she gotten herself into? The trio emerged into a back exit of the airport, where a black SUV waited by the curb. Marcus opened the door for her, and Claire hesitated for a split second before climbing inside. Once she was seated, Marcus and the suited man slid in beside her, and the vehicle pulled away swiftly, disappearing into the city streets. Claire's mind buzzed with questions, but she could barely form words. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "Marcus," she said, her voice shaky, "please tell me what's going on. What is this group you're talking about? Why would they target me?" Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. "Claire, this group, these people we're up against, they're not like anything you've seen before. They operate in the shadows, using ordinary events like today's flight as distractions for much larger, coordinated attacks. Their goal is to destabilize governments, economies, entire countries, and I'm part of the team trying to stop them." "But why me?" Claire pressed, her hands trembling in her lap. I don't have anything to do with this." Marcus sighed, looking out the window briefly before turning back to her. "It's because you were seen with me. The fact that you interacted with me before and during the incident on the plane has made you a potential target. They don't leave any loose ends, Claire. They'll see you as a liability." The words hit her like a ton of bricks. She was a target now, simply because she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She felt the weight of it settling in, the fear creeping deeper into her bones. The SUV weaved through the streets, heading away from the bustling downtown area toward quieter, more remote roads. Claire glanced nervously out the window, watching as the cityscape began to give way to open stretches of highway. The sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow across the horizon. "Where exactly are we going?" Claire asked again, trying to keep her voice steady. "To a safe house," the suited man spoke for the first time. His voice was deep and authoritative, giving Claire the sense that he was in control of the situation. "You'll be off the grid for a while. We need time to figure out our next move." Marcus nodded in agreement. "We have a network of secure locations. This one is remote, and more importantly, it's unknown to anyone outside our organization." Claire didn't respond. She didn't know what to say. The enormity of what was happening overwhelmed her. 1 minute, she had been an ordinary woman on a flight, and now she was being whisked away to a secret hideout because dangerous people were after her. As the SUV sped down the deserted highway, Claire's mind raced with thoughts of her family. What would she tell them? How could she explain this without putting them in danger too? She reached for her phone instinctively, but Marcus gently stopped her. "No phones," he said softly but firmly. "No contact with anyone outside this car." We can't risk them tracking you." Claire's heart sank. It was as if her entire life had been stripped away in an instant. The people she loved, the normalcy she had taken for granted, it was all gone, replaced by fear and uncertainty. After what felt like hours, the SUV finally slowed, pulling into a narrow, tree-lined road that led to a small, secluded cabin. The windows were dark, and the area around it was eerily quiet. Claire's stomach churned as they came to a stop in front of the cabin. The suited man stepped out first, scanning the area before motioning for Claire and Marcus to follow. The crisp night air hit Claire's face as she stepped out of the car, the silence around them unsettling. She could hear the rustle of leaves in the wind, but little else. "This will be our base for now," the suited man said, unlocking the cabin door and gesturing them inside. "We'll stay here until we're sure it's safe to move again." Marcus led Claire into the cabin, which was sparsely furnished but looked secure. The windows were reinforced, and there were surveillance cameras set up on the corners of the property. It was clear that this place was built for one purpose: protection. Claire sat down on the edge of a worn-out couch, her body exhausted from the adrenaline of the past several hours. She rubbed her temples, trying to stave off the growing headache from all the stress. Marcus crouched down beside her, his voice gentle. "I know this is a lot to take in. I promise we'll do everything we can to keep you safe, but you have to trust us." Claire looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there. She didn't know how she had gone from fearing and mistrusting this man to relying on him completely, but here she was. "I trust you," she whispered, though the fear still gnawed at her. Marcus nodded, his eyes softening. "Good. We'll get through this." Just as Marcus stood up, the suited man's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression darkening immediately. Without a word, he motioned to Marcus, who quickly joined him by the door. "What's happening?" Claire asked, her voice edged with panic. She couldn't handle another surprise. Not now. Marcus exchanged a quick, tense look with the suited man before turning back to Claire. "They'd found us," Marcus said, his voice low and urgent. "We have to move. Now." Claire's heart plummeted. "But I thought this place was secure." "It was," the suited man replied curtly. "But they're faster than we expected." Before Claire could process what was happening, there was a loud crash from outside, a sound like metal being twisted and torn apart. The cabin's lights flickered, and Claire's pulse raced as dread washed over her. Marcus rushed toward her, grabbing her hand. "Stay close to me. Don't leave my side." The next few moments were a blur of motion. The suited man barked instructions into a hidden earpiece. Marcus quickly grabbed a duffel bag from the corner, and Claire could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on gravel outside the cabin. "Go out the back," the suited man ordered, shoving open a door that led to the forest behind the cabin. "We'll cover you." Marcus pulled Claire through the door, into the cold night air, and they sprinted into the darkness of the trees. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Claire's breath came in short, panicked gasps as branches scratched her arms and face. They were being hunted, and whoever was after them was closing in fast. "Keep moving," Marcus urged, his grip on her hand firm, as they weaved through the thick underbrush. But just as they thought they had gained some distance, a shadowy figure stepped into their path, blocking their escape. Claire's heart froze in her chest. The figure stepped forward, a menacing smile on his face, and Claire realized with horror that they were cornered. Claire's breath hitched in her throat as the shadowy figure moved closer. His eyes gleamed in the moonlight, a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. She could feel Marcus tense beside her, his hand still gripping hers tightly. "Run," Marcus whispered urgently, but Claire could barely move. Her legs felt like they were made of stone. She glanced behind them. There was nowhere to go. The trees were dense, and the footsteps from the other attackers were getting closer. They were trapped. The figure in front of them chuckled, as if sensing their panic. "You really thought you could escape, didn't you?" His voice was smooth, cold, and full of confidence. Marcus stepped forward, shielding Claire with his body. "You don't have to do this," he said calmly, though Claire could hear the underlying tension in his voice. The man shook his head, still smiling. "It's too late for that. You and your little friend here have seen too much. My employers don't like loose ends." Claire's heart pounded in her ears. She could see the glint of a weapon in the man's hand. Something sharp, dangerous. Panic surged through her, but she knew running would be pointless. Marcus had done everything he could to protect her, but now it seemed like they had run out of options. Then, something unexpected happened. From behind the man, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Drop the weapon." The man froze, his smile faltering for the first time. Claire's eyes widened as another figure emerged from the trees. A woman, tall and imposing, with piercing eyes, and dressed in all black. She held a gun pointed directly at the attacker's head, her stance steady, her expression cold. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice now edged with uncertainty. The woman smirked, but her grip on the gun didn't waver. "Let's just say, I work for someone much higher up than your employers." For a moment, no one moved. The tension was unbearable. Claire barely breathed, watching the standoff unfold in front of her. She had no idea who this woman was, but something about her presence gave Claire a glimmer of hope. She didn't seem like a random stranger. She seemed like she had been waiting for this moment. The man clenched his jaw, his eyes darting between Marcus and the woman, calculating his next move. But before he could react, the woman pulled the trigger. A loud crack echoed through the trees, and the man dropped to the ground, his weapon falling uselessly beside him. Claire gasped, stumbling back into Marcus as the reality of what just happened hit her. The woman lowered her gun, her expression calm as she approached them. "You're safe now," she said, her voice low but authoritative. "Come with me. We need to get you out of here before the others catch up." Marcus nodded, still holding Claire's hand tightly. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. The woman glanced at him, her gaze sharp. "Let's just say I'm with a different part of the same organization. I've been tracking these people for a while, and I've been keeping an eye on you, Marcus. It looks like I showed up just in time." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't argue. There was no time for questions. The woman gestured for them to follow, and together they hurried deeper into the forest, moving swiftly and silently. As they moved, Claire's mind was reeling. Who was this mysterious woman? And why had she been watching Marcus? Everything was happening so fast, and yet, for the first time since the ordeal began, Claire felt a strange sense of relief. They had an ally, someone who seemed to know exactly what they were up against. After what felt like an eternity of running, they reached a small clearing where another black SUV was parked, hidden under the thick canopy of trees. The woman opened the door and motioned for them to get inside. "We're going to a new location," she said briskly. "It'll be safer than the cabin." Marcus helped Claire into the vehicle, and they both buckled up as the woman got behind the wheel. The SUV roared to life, and they sped off down a dirt path, the dark forest swallowing them up once more. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the trees outside. Claire sat in the back, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The danger, the threats, the mysterious group that seemed to be hunting them. It all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "Who sent you?" The woman kept her eyes on the road, but her lips curled into a faint smile. "You know who. The higher-ups. They'd been watching this operation closely, and when things started to go south, they sent me in as backup." Marcus nodded slowly, though Claire could see the tension still lingering in his posture. "What's the next step?" "We'll regroup," the woman replied. "We've eliminated the immediate threat, but there are still more of them out there. We need to lay low, figure out their next move, and take them out before they get to us. As they drove deeper into the night, Claire leaned back in her seat, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Her body ached. Her mind was a mess, but through it all, one thought stood out. She wasn't alone. Marcus had risked everything to protect her, and now this mysterious woman had appeared out of nowhere, saving them both in the nick of time. Somehow, despite all the terror and confusion, they had survived. But the danger wasn't over yet. Claire knew that much. There were still more questions than answers, and the people after them weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. But for now, as the SUV sped through the darkness, Claire allowed herself a moment of peace. She wasn't sure what the future held, but at least for tonight, she was alive. And that was something. As the moonlight flickered through the trees, Claire closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to breathe. The SUV moved swiftly through the darkness, its headlights piercing the thick forest ahead. Inside, the tension was palpable. Claire sat in the back seat, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. Marcus sat beside her, his gaze fixed out the window, deep in thought. The mysterious woman who had saved them drove in silence, her face a mask of calm determination. As the minutes ticked by, Claire couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had happened. The fear, the danger, and the relentless pursuit, it was all catching up to her. But now, there was something else creeping into her thoughts, an overwhelming need for closure. She wanted answers. She needed to know why her life had been turned upside down. Suddenly, the woman took a sharp turn down a gravel road that led to a large, nondescript warehouse hidden deep in the forest. The SUV came to a stop in front of the building, and the woman turned to Marcus and Claire. "This is it," she said simply, her eyes sharp. "We're going to finish this." Claire felt a lump form in her throat. "Finish it? How?" The woman glanced at her, her expression unreadable. "We're going to confront them. End this once and for all." Marcus nodded in agreement. "We can't keep running. If we don't stop them now, they'll never stop coming after us." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. The idea of confronting the people who had been hunting them terrified her, but she knew they had no other choice. She had been dragged into this nightmare, and the only way out was through. Without another word, they exited the SUV and approached the warehouse. The air was cool, the night eerily quiet. As they walked, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something much bigger than any of them realized. The woman led the way, her gun at the ready. Marcus stayed close to Claire, his protective instincts on high alert. They reached the massive steel doors of the warehouse, and the woman pressed a code into a hidden keypad. The doors creaked open, revealing the dimly lit interior. Inside, the warehouse was vast and empty, except for a small group of people standing near the center. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she recognized some of them. Figures from the plane, the airport, and even the man who had cornered them in the forest. These were the people responsible for everything. As they stepped into the warehouse, one of the men stepped forward, a smug smile on his face. He was tall, with graying hair and a sharp suit. His eyes gleamed with arrogance as he looked at Marcus, Claire, and the woman. "Well, well," the man said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I must admit, I didn't expect you to come to us willingly." Marcus squared his shoulders, his expression hard. "We're not here to negotiate. We're here to end this." The man laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "End it? Oh, my dear boy, you don't understand. This was never about you. You were just a pawn in a much larger game." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" The man's eyes flicked to her, his smile widening. "Ah, Miss Claire, you still don't know, do you? This was never about you either. You were simply collateral damage." Claire's stomach churned. "Collateral damage? You've been trying to kill me." The man shrugged nonchalantly. "Your presence on that flight was inconvenient, yes, but the real target has always been Marcus." Marcus's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "Why?" The man's smile faded, and his expression darkened. Because of what you know. Because of who you are. Claire looked at Marcus in confusion. What is he talking about? Marcus hesitated, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and resolve. Claire, there's something I haven't told you. Something I've been keeping from everyone. The man interrupted with a sneer. He's not just a government agent, Miss Claire. He's the son of one of the most powerful men in the world. A man who has made a lot of enemies. Claire's heart skipped a beat. What? Marcus looked at her, his expression full of apology. It's true. My father is a highly influential figure, someone who's made it his mission to take down dangerous organizations like this one. They've been after me for years, trying to use me as leverage against him. The pieces suddenly clicked into place for Claire. This wasn't about her at all. She had been caught in the crossfire of a much bigger battle, one that involved power, politics, and international intrigue. The people chasing them had wanted Marcus all along, hoping to use him as a pawn in their twisted game. The man stepped forward, his voice full of malice. Your father can't protect you forever, Marcus. And now we have you right where we want you. Marcus stood tall, his expression defiant. You'll never get to him. And you won't get to me either. The man's eyes gleamed. We'll see about that. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Claire turned, her heart racing, as a group of armed men appeared from the shadows, surrounding them. It felt like the end. But then, the mysterious woman stepped forward, her eyes cold and unflinching. You made a mistake coming here, she said, her voice steady. The man frowned. And why is that? The woman smiled, a dangerous, knowing smile. Because we're not alone. In an instant, the warehouse erupted into chaos. The doors burst open, and a team of heavily armed operatives stormed in, taking down the armed men with precision and efficiency. Claire watched in stunned silence as Marcus and the woman fought alongside the operatives, overpowering the attackers. Within minutes, the fight was over. The man who had taunted them was on his knees, handcuffed, his smug expression replaced with one of defeat. The other members of his group were being led away by the operatives, their plans foiled. Marcus turned to Claire, breathing heavily but unharmed. It's over, he said softly. Claire's knees nearly buckled with relief. The nightmare was finally over. As the operatives secured the warehouse and escorted the remaining members of the shadowy group out, Claire stood beside Marcus, her heart still racing. She had been through so much, facing danger, fear, and uncertainty. But now, as she looked at Marcus, she realized something important. She wasn't just collateral damage. She had played a part in stopping something much bigger than herself. And though her life would never be the same, she knew she had made it through the storm. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression softening. Thank you, Claire. I'm sorry for everything you've been through, but you're safe now. Claire nodded, her throat tight with emotion. I know. As they walked out of the warehouse, the cool night air hit her face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Claire breathed deeply. She was free. And though the path ahead was uncertain, she knew one thing for sure: she had survived.